We had started to talk about larger institutional buildings. We'd done concert halls. You watched the Gary film, more or less, with the birds and stuff. If I asked you what the part about, you know, from the Gladiator when a guy walks in and says, looks at the Coliseum and says, "I had no idea man could do such things." Did you get that? What was that about? Blonde. What was that scene about? Yeah, but I mean, now you have to interpret it because you remembered. If you'd had enough sense to do what everybody else did and forget, what do you just think? What do you think? Why do you think I put that there? Come on, it's what you're paying money for. Just guess, because it's funny. You could guess that. No, but did you have? Just try something. Don't worry, I'll put 2 or 3 people on the spot. Waiting for this thing to warm up. Okay, not bad. So I show you different types of architecture. Do you know how that cost me $10,000 to get that scene? I had to pay the guy. What's the guy's name that made it?
Ridley Scott.
Yeah, Ridley Scott, and I had to pay the actor. There were 3 actors, but only one. I had to pay. What's the guy from Australia? I had to pay him $5,000, and I had to get Frank Gehry to call him. I couldn't even get in touch with him. And I had to pay Jeremy Irons $25,000 to read it, and he read it on a lunch break. I handed him the script. This was the deal. He said, "I'll do it on the lunch break. I'll do one take it or leave it, 25 grand, and you got about 10 minutes." So I said, okay. I handed it to him, and he looked through it. He said, "How do you want me to pronounce this?" And then he said, "How do you want it to sound?" And I said, "I want it to sound so serious that it's funny." And he did pretty good, don't you think? Meanwhile, I'm trying to figure out, how do I get his autograph, you know? So I'm saying, "Here, please sign all these contracts." Anybody else have an idea about why I used that scene? Well, first of all, it's true. I wanted to show some architecture. I wanted to have somebody looking at something in awe before it turned into Frank Gehry's Bilbao Museum and all that sort of stuff. But the other thing is, the scene is, did anybody see the movie? Good. The movie is about, I don't know if you realize it or not, the movie is just a retelling of the story of Moses. It's like, it's the biblical telling of the story of Moses, except taken out of Egypt and the Bible, and, you know, you put in Rome. But basically, it's about a guy who was a leader in Rome who ends up being a slave, and he has to set himself free and help others set themselves free. But the slave says, the guy who has never been to Rome before, it's the slave who says, "I had no idea man could build such things." And in that moment, when he sees this work of architecture, he begins to realize that men do things that he had never imagined them to be able to do, which is also foreshadowing his ability to fight to set himself free. So the scene works in the movie as a way of foreshadowing our own ability to rise above ourselves by discovering the great works of others. Now, he had just passed a bunch of jugglers and fire eaters and bird trainers, and I'm sure somebody who, another slave saw a fire eater and said, "God, I've never seen anybody eat fire before." You know, so it doesn't always have to be architecture. But the question is that the great achievements of each of us in our own way help lift the ambitions of the rest of us. And so that's why museums and libraries are really important buildings. And so today we're going to talk about museums and libraries for a little bit. Then if we have some time, we'll look at your storyboards, which were really hilarious and quite moving, actually, I thought. I'm a little bit angry at my GAs, and I will be having a word with them after class, just so that, you know, they have to stay after class, and they're going to get punished, just like y'all do. Okay, this is a typical museum. This is a press for full screen. Okay, this is the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It's basically, generally libraries and traditional museums are built like this because their role is to house the great achievements of mankind, of all of us. And whether those achievements are intellectual, as in books, or artistic, or scientific, or historic. So we honor them and we celebrate them, and we put them in a setting that dignifies their role in our lives. Now, the setting is also one that we also associate with power. We also associate it with religion. And we also know that it can be abused. So, for example, this very same architecture can be used to honor art, or it can be used to honor a despot, or it can be used to show off wealth. So it has a mixed history, but the reason, so we expect to see these, and they basically have this basic organization. This is the Greek temple organization. They get off the ground. Notice there's this grand ceremonial staircase, and the beautiful columns and Greek references to Greek and Roman architecture. So oftentimes you see that language, which is called classical language. In this particular case, because it's a neoclassical building, and you'll learn a little bit this in your TA stuff, in your dissertations. But so it's a typical way we do libraries and museums, and you can kind of see this in all of them. There's always a great hall that you go into. And the point of this is when you're inside, it's pretty much anything you find in there better damn well be important. That's basically the message. If you get a book off the shelf, you know it's a good book. If you see a painting on the wall, you know it's a good painting, because the building is just flat out said, like it or not, it's good. In fact, like it or not, it's great, and so you better like it. And so this is a kind of problem that's been interesting architects, particularly 20th century architects, for a while, and we're going to look at their responses to it. We've already looked at some museums. We saw this one early at the first lecture. This is the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And it's an unusual museum because it has an unusual job. It basically has to convey the horrors of what it was like for the Jews in the Holocaust. And so it's not unusual. I mean, it has a very particular role, and so it takes on a very particular architectural language. We've seen this museum. You saw this last week. It's an unusual museum, but it's an unusual museum because it's trying to find a new relationship to the context. On the inside, however, there's a grand space, grand entry space, sort of make you feel the same way as those grand entry spaces. Also, there's ways that the ways that you are being led to expect the art and to understand the art is important. This looks like a big painting. It's a work, part of the architecture, but it kind of sits in the space like a work of art. And then the language of the architecture itself echoes some of the arts that you see in it. So this is a fairly traditional museum on the inside. In other words, it makes the work seem important, and it tries to create a setting which helps you receive it as and be interested in it. Not every museum is about trying to fit into the context or trying to be a good neighbor. This is maybe the second most famous building that I know in the 20th century. This is the Pompidou Center in Paris. It's the most visited museum in Europe. Everybody that goes to Paris goes, you know that young girl that I should have brought the picture. You remember the young girl that we saw go to the Opera House? Well, the next day, all the rest of the pictures were her here. And it looks really ridiculous, don't you think? I mean, but basically the idea was that we live in the 20th century. It's the time of machines, and those machines, and if we look at the world around us that we take for granted, it already is a kind of art. And so the two architects, Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers, see, I'm doing pretty good this is like half my brain's not here, so I'm doing okay. They wanted to celebrate the mechanical world that we live in, and although it makes a really difficult place to put art in, so everything you walk outside of it, walk inside of it, everybody goes and visits it. There's theater, there's street theater and clowns and stuff outside. It's a really difficult place. The inside's like the grand lobby is now like a train station, but inside's kind of difficult to see the art. You have to take a year's extra training to figure out how to put art up in there for temporary shows, because the space is it's like being inside a machine, but it still is a work of architecture. It's really fantastic. And there's always something new and interesting going on in museums and libraries. It's one of the building types that's most interesting for two reasons. It doesn't suffer the problem of the building type yet. Remember, I don't know if you remember, but the first couple of lectures I said that we don't really study architecture by studying the building type. Building type is a library, a school, house, a hospital. If you come and you study architecture, you're not going to take a course on hospitals, or you're not going to take a course on libraries. You're going to take a course on architectural effects and how to produce those. And so museums and libraries, to a slightly lesser extent, are still really open to architectural exploration. I think mainly because nobody really cares what happens to the stuff inside. I'm not sure that's true, but they're very important to tourists, they're very important to the community, and it's not like a hospital where if it takes a long time to get from one room to another museum because you get lost, that's not so bad. If it takes a long time to get to the patient, that's not so good. So we don't do as many hospitals as we should be. But this is a really fantastic proposal for a museum in Abu Dhabi. It's very similar to Frank Gehry's, it's a gigantic dome, and all of those these are all the galleries. So all the galleries are little bitty buildings built in the language of the Middle East under this giant dome. No one knows how to build it, or if it won, it probably won't get built. Makes nice light. But it's about the context. It's about finding a new relationship to the context and producing a kind of spectacle and also a celebration and something awe-inspiring as a place to see the art. Most of the time, though, buildings are, you just basically have to work out the program. But there are occasions when what we think of as sort of normal buildings actually turn out to be incredible works of architecture. Now, this is Mies van der Rohe, this building and this building. This is Mies van der Rohe's National Gallery in Berlin. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum in New York City. They look kind of old. This one looks sort of modern, not so particularly interesting. This one looks sort of goofy, I'd say. Although you should recognize it as an upside-down pyramid, basically. But I have, in my opinion, these are two of the greatest buildings of the 20th century. Not because they look so spectacular like we saw some of the other stuff, but because of what they do architecturally. And so we're going to start off by describing these two buildings. And actually, this building was built in 1950. This building was built in 1962. And the year is important because the context in which they're building these buildings is in the aftermath of World War II. So when you go to Berlin, it kind of looks like this. You kind of go up a flight of stairs. It looks like a kind of typical modern glass building. If part of its history, if you look closely, this is the old museum. This is called the Altes Gallery or Altes Museum in Berlin. It's by Schinkel. And so this building is intentionally meant to sort of echo that. So these columns, and that entablature are meant to echo these columns and that entablature. And this foreground is supposed to echo this foreground. And so it was, and a lot of what Mies did was about honoring his history, and Schinkel was the most important German architect immediately preceding Mies. And so, but the real history, let me have a swallow of this. I know y'all are thinking, you and I are thinking the exact same thing right this second. Only 55 more minutes to go, and we can get the hell out of here. But I'll make it, I swear. But this was the real history, because this was Berlin in 1945, and it took about 11 years for the reconstruction to be completed. The building was commissioned in 1962. The city is entirely destroyed. And not only that, it's guilty of the worst crimes against humanity in history. 9 million people dead in the concentration camps. 9 to 11 million people dead in the concentration camps. Plus, 6 months before he gets the commission for the building, the Russians build the Berlin Wall. And in my lifetime, the Berlin Wall was the defining political feature up till now. This was, when I grew up, basically the Berlin Wall was built in '62. It came down in 2000, when did it come down? 2000? 99. When was it?
89.
89, was it?
Yeah. Germany reunified in 1990.
Oh, okay, so it came down 30 years later. Man, math is hard. So for 30 years, it was the tragedy of Europe. These are people praying at the wall. Reagan went over and said, Chairman Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And so Mies van der Rohe gets the commission to build a museum right after the destruction of Berlin. There are still traces of the burning and the soot visible in the buildings near the site of that museum, and 6 months after the Berlin Wall gets built. And so he has to find a way to find a place for for art in this context. He's been asked to build a building to put art in this context. And it's actually quite an amazing, what would you do? You can't make what would you say about the role of art in that situation? And he essentially produces what I consider to be one of the great tragic operas. So this is architecture as opera, and it's architecture telling a tragic story about the state of the world and the role of art in it. This is how it looked. This is at its opening, but this is a church that was built that was still charred as the building was under construction. And we talked about this when we were talking about concert halls. This is the Shirin Philharmonic. And if you remember, the language he chose to do that in was to completely disassociate any new architecture with the history of Berlin and the history of the immediate history of the German Reich. And so this is the first building to be built after the library and the Shirin Concert Hall, and it's this National Gallery. And actually, it's really, when you look at it, this is the site plan. This is when you look down on it, it looks basically blank. So you drive up, it's got a big square in the middle. This is a garden. This is a platform. And the plans, I think, start to show a little bit about, I don't know, maybe it's only because I know what the story is, but they seem already to be coping with the gravity of the problem that he has to figure out how to solve architecturally. So you can enter the building like this. You can enter the building up these stairs off the street. And that entry is to remind you of this entry. But the more important entry sequence goes this way. You walk down this, you walk up these staircases. Now remember, you're walking up a staircase. It used to be you're walking up the staircase because the staircase would separate the profane and the sacred. So you go into a church, you leave the everyday world, you take the staircase up, and you land inside the world of the sacred. And the feeling of going up those staircases is the architectural device to get you ready to pray, or get you ready for a court of law, or get you ready for the auspicious situation. So he brings you up the staircase, but you're not actually facing the building. You're facing out into the city, and most importantly, the first thing you see is the concert hall. So you're facing the ambition for Berlin to find a new and better future, but you're not actually facing the museum. You get up there, you see the city, and you land on this plot. This is called a cycle, but you land on a big platform, and all you see is the city. You're looking all around, you see the city. So you're up in a sort of sacred area where art should be, where you should have gone up when you went up those other museums. You're about to go in the art museum. You survey the city, and all of a sudden you walk into the museum and there's nothing there. So the first thing you see is an empty building, and it's basically a temple for art, or a temple for where art should have been, now empty. Because in a sense, there's no place for art in this world. And then you go in, the glass reflects, I don't know if you can see me, but this is me. I'm in this photograph. I don't know how to take a photograph, so generally you can find me in the reflections. I guess I was looking at the sky. So, the building is doing everything it can to reflect the context of its situation, but it is basically a skeleton of a building with nothing left in it. And so it's a kind of comment on the impossibility of putting art in this situation. So you go inside, that's it. That's the entire museum. So you're actually not in the museum yet. You thought you were going to go in the museum when you went up the staircase. You're not in the museum. You thought you were going to go in the museum when you walk in the building. No museum. What ends up happening is you go down. Let's see. You have to go downstairs, and all the art is downstairs in the museum. So this is the art. These are all the art galleries. And so you go down this, so you're downstairs. Now, if this is a temple, what's downstairs? What's in the basement of cathedrals? Well, guess. You could say the heater. You could say lawn equipment. But generally, what's in the basement of churches and cathedrals, traditional churches and cathedrals, are crypts. That's where the bodies of bishops and, I don't know, various parts of Jesus and all sorts of stuff is stored down there in the crypts. And you know that because Indiana Jones usually goes down to a couple of them. So what he's done is put the art in the crypt, basically either because there's no place for it and it has to be protected or buried in honor, or it has to be saved for the future. So you go downstairs. So actually, you never actually go into a museum. Like you go up a staircase, into a door, and actually to get to the art, you go downstairs and you're there. So there's no doorway. The staircase is actually working as the doorway. And you actually never enter in a museum. You get down in the basement in this crypt. And if you notice, so you've come down the staircase, which I think is, I can't read plans, but it's one of these things, I think. And then these are the galleries. And then as you keep going, you get out here. And that's a sculpture garden. And you're about as far away from the city as you can possibly be. And it's the most serene vision of use of art. It's unbelievable. It's like being in heaven. It's beautiful. And so the journey has taken you from the most horrifying situation to a kind of tragic statement about the impossibility of art to survive in that situation. You visited the art downstairs in the crypt, and then you walk out into the sculpture garden, and you're as far away as you can possibly be, except for the fact that you're exactly back in the seat straight. This is the sculpture garden, and if you follow this line, this is the street. So when you're back exactly on the same level. Let's see if I can find a better picture for you. Where's that picture? So you're here, and that level is exactly the same level as the street. So in fact, you've come back to the street, except as Mies would like the world of art to bring it to sometime in the future. And it's a kind of tragic ending with a sort of kind of beautiful melody about the possibilities of the future on the street level. And then you have to go back through the whole thing, and then you go back down and you're outside. And it's an amazing thing. And if you ever go to Berlin, most people that are there, they don't know about World War II. They don't remember the Berlin Wall. The art is up. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. There's shops, But I think once you know the story and you see it, you will never not feel it when you're there. It's really one of the most amazing experiences you'll ever have. And it's contained in the architecture if you like architecture. And then if you like the way architecture can become an opera. The exact opposite to that is this building. This building here. This is the Guggenheim Museum in New York City by Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright is a great architect, but he hated cities. He didn't like to build in the city, or he hated New York City. But he got commissioned to build this thing, and so he builds a sort of, if you know New York City, it's on a grid, all the buildings are kind of square, so he builds something that stands out like a work of art already in the city. So it already has a kind of sculptural presence in the city, but that's just the beginning of it. So it stands out. New York in 1950 is the city of the victors of World War II. They are not the city of the tragic. They're not the losers, and they're not the people who are living in the city that's in a carcass of a city, and they're not blamed for the worst crimes in the world. These are the people who won the war, who are celebrating their moral victory, they're in a financial heyday. People are rich, and they're celebrating their military, the sense of themselves in the world is a future, is all possibilities of the future. So Frank Lloyd Wright does just the exact opposite thing as Mies. He does a comic opera about the role of art. And if you notice, you walk right in off the street. You don't go up any stairs, you don't go down any stairs, just go straight off the street into the this is the bookstore now, and then there's a sculpture garden. It's exactly on the level. And so you come in, and this drawing is kind of interesting. You're coming in here, and the first thing you do is you look up and you see this space. Now, it's pretty neat. Whether you know anything about architecture or not, it's a neat space. But if you know something about architecture, it should remind you of something. It should remind you of this building. This is the Pantheon in Rome. And this is what it looks like. Now, the Pantheon in Rome was built by Herod after they won a great war. Does anybody remember what war it was? I don't know. A great war won by Herod, the Great War of Herod. Which he fought in BC. Look it up. We all know it, but you should look it up. But anyway, and so it has qualities that are really interesting to us. I mean, you can kind of tell it looks like this, but when you go inside there, it's called the Pantheon because all the gods, he built this temple in principle to thank all the gods for the strength and wealth of Rome and their great victory. But it's also called a panopticon view. In other words, whoever walks in there gets to see all the gods, and it creates a power relationship between the viewer and the gods. And in a certain sense, it's also a statement of the power of Rome over the gods. So it honors them, but because we can go in and see them all at one time, and we stand amongst them, it's a kind of power, a statement of the power of Rome in relationship to the gods. And so the first thing you do when you walk in the Guggenheim is see that. You're in the Pantheon, except all of the gods are now replaced by art. Because in our world, libraries and art museums are really about celebrating those achievements as being transcendental aspects of our lives. And so he puts all the art where museums used to put it in, and that's in the place of the gods. Next thing you do is you take an elevator up and you walk out and you look down. And at that moment, the difference between the Pantheon and the Guggenheim is clear because now you're with the gods. You're up there with them and you're looking down. And as you look down, you start to see these incredible perspectival views that are associated in architecture with the Baroque church. Basically, it starts to get really thrilling. You feel like you're immersed in the space, and you can get kind of dizzy. It's not just it's not just looking down, but looking across gets really amazing. But then as you look more across, you realize that you're starting to look at people, and they're not looking at you. And that reminds you not of being in a Roman church or in a Baroque church. That reminds you of being outside on the street. Because you're watching people walk by, sort of, I don't know what y'all call it. We used to call it, I don't know, I can even say what we used to call it anymore, but bird dogging. Do y'all have bird dogging? Anyway, the great thing about this is you're staring at them while they're looking at the art. And they're more interesting than the art, And so as you walk down this ramp, you realize that he's turned this thing, it's sort of like a parking lot. He's turned this into a street. And so he's done what artists said they always wanted to do, and that was to get their work out of the museum and onto the street. He created a work of art that does that. And so it's a fantastic idea about the way art will participate in our lives. And not only that, it's an architectural space which makes the viewing of art and the viewing of our everyday, our actions as important, if not more important, than the art itself. Now, not every museum has such great circumstances as World War II or such auspicious circumstances, great or tragic, whether it's the Holocaust or World War II or this is the Whitney Museum. He just had to build a building for a museum. It's in New York as well, and he built a building. He didn't want to build a Greek temple work of architecture. He wanted to build a building which tried to think of a new relationship of art to the public. And when you look at it, what does it kind of look like? Does it look like an India? Does it look inviting? Like, are you happy to go in there? Can't wait to get inside? Does it say, come on in? Jeremy, come on down. Deal or no deal? No, it's a big fortress, and it's basically, if you look really careful, it has a moat around it. And you have to cross a bridge to get in there. He's basically putting art in a situation where only those people, it takes you out of the noise of the city, it isolates you on that bridge, and then you go into a space which protects you from the city and allows you to contemplate art in its greatness. And so this is a particular philosophy about how art should be viewed and how we should honor art with quiet dignity and respect, not so much pretending like it's royal or rich or equal to the gods, but it's something in our lives as something that we should study quietly and contemplate in isolation. And so he builds the Whitney Museum. Now, lots of libraries are done. Lots of great libraries are designed and never got built, but they still have tremendous influence on architecture. This is one by Rem Koolhaas. We've already seen Rem Koolhaas's work a couple of times, and in your recitations, you will begin to associate specific works in clusters with some of the architects we've mentioned. But this is a library proposal for the National Library of Paris, and he didn't win it. And what you're looking at is not the library, but this is everything that's a solid in this photograph is a room, and everything that's void is solid. So what this library is one big solid, so all of this air is solid with books, filled with books. And these are the rooms that you go to in the reading rooms. And so you come in, you take an elevator, and you get off in these reading rooms. You never know where you are in the library, because what he wanted to do, and so it looks like this. So this is one of those reading rooms. And these are the elevators. We're looking down now. And all this black stuff is the books. And so he wanted to make a library. It's a little bit like the Whitney Museum in the sense that you don't know where you are, you're isolated, and you're separated from the city. But this is not being separated from the city in the way of protecting the work. So he has to invent new ways to draw these. So these are the floor plans and sections. But this is the most interesting drawing. You notice that these are just the shapes of the room projected into plan. Why that's important is the plans don't make any sense in this building. They're not a map of how to get around. They're not a spatial arrangement. They're just a diagram. You're in a hole. You're in a big mountain, and you're in these various shaped holes, and you get to and from these holes by these elevators. And then so he has to invent this kind of drawing. It's called a collapse space or superpositional diagram of the rooms, and that's the plan. But probably the more interesting, you start to get more interested when you see this, because this is a Cindy Sherman. I think I showed you the Cindy Sherman. Did we do we did that. So he's already using Cindy Sherman many years earlier. Cindy Sherman was the person in the Opera House who does portraits of herself and projects herself into odd roles in a way of basically getting you to project yourself in that same role. This is the library. This is her as a librarian in something called an untitled movie still. And so all of a sudden, the idea that the library is going to be about changing your character, which is going to be a crucial issue in Rem Koolhaas, is already starting to show up in this library. But let me just say, this is the kind of junky stuff architecture does. What this library is really about, so the coffee's kicking in now, my headache's clearing up. I can tell because I'm starting to move. Okay, guys. God, that was horrible. There must be some, if anybody has not that I need it often, but if anybody has an incredible cure for a hangover, or have heard one from people who are legally old enough to drink, please, please pass it on. Okay. What Rem was trying to say in this library is that libraries are not places in Paris that you walk to. The tradition of Paris is you walk down the Champs-Élysées, you see all these great buildings. He was saying Paris is a place where people take subways, you know, and they go from place to place. The truth of Paris is that it's underground and that it's a subway and that there is no such thing as these great boulevards and lights and all that sort of stuff. It's really about moving through dark voids, arriving someplace, doing what you have to do, and moving on. And so he turned the subways of Paris into this library. So watch. Now this is a drawing of a reading room. So you understand this is a plan. Y'all can read this as a plan now, right? So these are the columns. This is that room. This is, you know, you'd get off at the elevator here. You'd walk over to this reading room. But watch. See that? Those are the plans. But in the plans, he basically draws the subway going through the building. And that makes this building unbelievably famous in architecture. It's like this is one of the most important projects ever built. Everybody in architecture talks about this building, still loves this building, never got building. Mainly because it does sort of goofy stuff like that. So if you like doing stuff like that, and you don't have to build it, and he won a big prize. Now, so that later on, however, he changed his mind about libraries and about institutions. And so he does this library, and it's also in Paris. It's at a school. It was supposed to be 2 separate buildings, each 3 stories. Rem and a lot of architects, they're kind of famous for breaking the rules and seeing if they can get away with it. And so he won the competition. So he put the two libraries on top of each other. And what this library is, if you look carefully, is a combination of this diagram. This is a Mason domino diagram, which we saw, which basically everybody in all these plates, remember in the 5 points, these are equipotential fields, meaning this person is exactly equal to this person, but they're looking out. One thing you notice is they're always looking out to the city. And so we think of this as a diagram in which the architectural space starts at the building and goes out. And then he combined it with this view, this voyeuristic view, where people are staring at other people. And he made a library where if you're standing here, so you can tell, you see this staircase here? You see these columns? You can tell that he's thinking about these libraries. The staircase is at the corner, the columns are almost the same thing. But instead of having equal potential fields that everybody stares out, he starts to fold the plate so that if you're standing here, you can look up and see this person, and that person can look up and see that person. And he creates a kind of libidinal field inside the library. It becomes a place to go and, look up people's pants. I'm sorry to say. Actually, it pretty much sucks as a library other than that. There's no place to put any books, for example. I mean, it has this beautiful diagram. You see where this space, you see this where it pinches down to here? So instead of being completely flat all the way across and so it's equal, it actually creates a situation where the space goes from a primary space to a secondary space to where you'd put a bathroom, a tertiary space, all in one continuous field. That's going to become a really important diagram. That's called the single surface diagram. And then he uses these elevators to move through it. So the whole thing is about changing the library from a place that's, changing the library from a place that's, that you go and you study and you read quietly to this kind of place, to where you go and you're sort of erotically charged, or at least you're civically charged, and you engage the life of other people in the context of the books. And it was a really important building. The trouble with this building is there's no way to put anything around it. You just kind of screw it up. You can't put glass around it because, so he didn't ever have an answer what the outside was going to look like. This is just the inside, and it never got built as well. But it set into motion a bunch of projects, these single surface projects, where everybody tried to make these ribbon surfaces where everything was connected into one thing. And there are dozens of them. You've seen some of them. So it's one single surface. This is a proposal for the BBC studios in London. So now the single surface starts to look like a film strip. And I don't know what this is. But and also you start to see it in other things. This is in fashion design. This is Issey Miyake. This is a proposal for a dress. Does anybody know this? Wouldn't you like to have one of these? You have to have like 20 friends to go with you everywhere you want to go. I think the idea was it's one piece of cloth that you can then cut to any size, and it's called, isn't that right? And this is a museum that came out of that single surface museum, so you can see. Now, the interesting thing about these single surface idea is it really has caught the imagination of architects, and really, I have a collection of maybe 100 buildings and proposals using it. It doesn't quite do anything. No one knows quite what it does. It doesn't hold, it can't stand up by itself, so it's not like a static archetype. It doesn't really change, like people don't actually walk from here to here and walk upside down, and you can't really do anything on it. They just look cool. I mean, that looks cool, that looks cool. It's sort of a way of imagining that you're connected to, it creates an architecture that's open and that you imagine yourself to be connected to the events that are going on around you in ways that you can't literally be. This is a museum in Cincinnati. We're going to do a little bit of work in Cincinnati. I think one of your assignments is going to be to walk to Cincinnati, take a picture of this building, and walk back by, and you have to do it between classes. So, have you handed that one out yet?
Still working on the wording.
Okay. You're not allowed to use the walk on the interstate, by the way. You have to walk all the way through the woods. I don't know what. I have no idea what that's about. This is a really wonderful museum. The first idea is that it's contextual, but different than any other way it's not like Frank Gehry. And that is, if you look at the massing, the general massing around there, it's reiterated in these. So it doesn't look anything like the buildings around it. So, this concrete and this black mass. But you get a sense of it being like them, it's kind of turned the general context into a work of art. And so it begins by presenting the city itself back to the city as a work of art in the city. We're going to be mostly interested in the way it meets the ground, as usual. If you'll notice from this drawing, this is like the frame, and then these things hang out on the front of it. But the street comes in, I'm going the wrong way, comes all the way along here. So this is one surface, goes all the way in, turns here, so it's a single surface, and then goes up the wall, like that. See it? And all of a sudden, if these volumes are the shops and the retail stores, and this is the street now become vertical, what's this? What separates the street and the stores? Good. Report yourself as getting an A. Or, I don't know your name. Pick a friend that wants an A, sell your name to them, and whoever delivers your name can get an A. Good, very good. It's a sidewalk. So it's a really wonderful way of saying, look, just like Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to put the art, get it out of the museum and into the sidewalk, Zaha Hadid is a great Iraqi architect, has actually made the galleries into little retail shops and created a circulation system which lets you circulate through those separate from those, and in fact passing through them. And this is it. And so here's it's a really strange building. Most people hate it, I think. So there's the surface. Also, so here's the frame. Here's the big painting of the city. Now you come in, this is the street, and then but in this space here is the sidewalk, and then you go into each of these galleries to see the art. And actually, you don't feel that the art is very special. And actually, this is the point of the building. It's very much like the Wexler Center, which we're going to discuss next week. There's nothing particularly special about the art because you feel like you're walking in and out of it. You don't feel like, it has no sense of you have arrived at a place that's important. It's perfect for contemporary art. It's actually exactly the best way to see it because there's no pretensions to tell you anything about it in advance. There's no promise that it's great. It's just in a store, in a gallery. And it's actually one of the most successful museums, I think. Also, all the curators hate it, and most of the artists hate it because they want you to say, this is a great work of art. You know, they want the museum to say it's a great work of art. I think it's personally, I like it. So we're not going to look at this. I mean, we've seen this artist. Now, this artist's name is Scafidio and Diller. This is that museum. This is called the IB Museum in New York. These are the elevators. These little transparent things. They must be made of something very thin. This is one of their most famous buildings. Has anybody ever seen this building before? It's a pretty good building, don't you think? It is. You think I'm kidding, right? This is the Blur building in Switzerland. It was a temporary building for an exposition. Oftentimes, architects will do pavilions for World's Fairs and stuff. And all this building is one gigantic cloud machine. So that's actually what it looks like. It's called the Blur building. And then you kind of walk along this bridge. You put a raincoat on, you get soaking wet. You get in it, it's really horrible because you're soaking wet and cold. And then you run back out and you get over here, you take a picture, and you tell everybody how great it was. Okay, but so this architect has been working on these two themes for a long time. Basically, this kind of this sense of form and space, and also this sort of single surface building. And in their museum, this is the Boston ICA. And if you look carefully, you can see it's a single surface building. There it is. But then they've decided to put the galleries up on top. So this is actually a less interesting building in a certain way than the Zaha Hadid building, because Zaha's basically, her single surface goes right through it, and it kind of interrupts the art with the sidewalk. Whereas in this case, the single surface goes up, makes a kind of boardwalk, but then this sits on the top of it, a little bit like that cloud, but a little bit like what else? Does it look like something else to any of you? Go ahead, I know you. No, the one who's getting the eye. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Mies van der Rohe's National Gallery. That one? The box? Which one? Villus of All. Exactly, good. Yeah, exactly. It's either this. I was just thinking of this lecture. It's very rare for someone any student I've ever had, including all my graduate students, to remember anything from another lecture. But I think of it as kind of like this, sort of sitting, not like that, sort of sits there like that. But Villus of All is exactly right. It's just a floating, pure prism. Whoop, there you go. It is actually ridiculous that we do this, don't you think? It's also ridiculous that, like, you can get a college degree in this. Drawing funny drawings with like, isn't that ridiculous? But anyway, so this is supposed to be the cloud. It's supposed to be a little bit like the Villus of All is exactly right when you're looking at the ribbon window, absolutely right. But it's an ideal modern box on the top. The reason I mentioned Mies van der Rohe is because it sits up. In a way, like his work is always really close to the ground and has a kind of staircase going up to it, whereas Villus of All, but it's okay, it's a good reference. And what's interesting about it is there's a single surface. Now, it's turned in the drawings, these are the first competition drawings, so you'll notice that there's a boardwalk that's used to annotate the surface. So this is all made of wood, and that's a traditional waterfront boardwalk. And then, and there you see, now, what's going on in it, remember, every museum is going to be trying to tell us some kind of story about art. And what Liz and Rick are doing is something that they've been doing for a long time. It's not just the single surface and its connectivities of connecting the public in all sorts of imaginal ways. there's these, what do you call this? A kind of grandstand that you look at the water. This is a traditional relationship between a building and an amenity like the water is a place to look out of it. Then, when you get up in this space, this is the theater space, and it becomes, let's see if I have it becomes the background to the theater. So all of a sudden, the museum has changed from a machine for normal viewing of the theater, of the ocean, to now that the theater can use the city as a kind of stage set. So that's the second visual manipulation. The museum is is manipulating the city like art manipulates everyday life to create new ways to see. Then you go to the third space, and then this is this space right here. This is the videotheque. So you come in, you sit down on this slant right there. And what that means you see is you're looking at the water now, but the water is isolated so that the screens of the videotheque, the default blue of the screen, is now the water and the window. And so this is a third way that the museum is now reconstructing reality and making an artwork out of it. And then the last way, which is the most fantastic, is when you go up to this space, remember the one, when you're up there, this was supposed to be a lenticular wall. Now, so there's supposed to be art hanging on this wall. A lenticular wall is such that it's completely opaque until you're at a right angle at it. So just like works of art, you cannot see the best view of the city and the best view in the best space in the entire museum until you face it like a work of art. So when you're on the oblique, it completely is blank, and when you're facing straight at it, you see a normal view, and all of a sudden it takes a traditional good view of a building and turns it into a work of art. And so the building in four different ways constructs four completely different points of view, and it does so in order to make a discussion of the relationship between art and architecture and the degree to which art is about reframing everyday life. There's some interesting technical problems. You can see the single surface here, but this is the section of the building, and notice you can't get this surface to go all the way through. So there's no way for it to end on the other side. This is the space that I was telling you about. This is the video space. And see, it's pretty good, don't you think? But because the client was an asshole, they didn't pay, I'm sorry, how do you say that correctly in a jackass? I'm sorry. Yeah, because the client was a jackass. They didn't want to pay for the lenticular wall. And so this view is now it's a big party room, and everybody sees the normal view, and it ruined the whole architecture. This had to be completely blank, or else in other words, now it's completely traditional, whereas this was supposed to be the most radical space. The way it ends up when you go visit it, it's the most traditional space, just a good view. In fact, it's not even a particularly good view because the corridor is so narrow. But instead of hanging art here, they have parties here. It's really ridiculous. And that happens all the time. It's why it's worth studying the architecture as a project and learning something about it, because more often than not, there'll be compromises in the building. Sometimes that's to the building's advantage, sometimes it doesn't matter. In this case, it's like going dun, 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 and then stopping. It screws it up. For some, you're going to do a detail problem pretty soon. And here's a kind of detail issue. Here's a detail problem. Here's the single surface, no problem. And you can see that it's extruded all the way to the other side, but we know from the section that it doesn't actually get extruded from the other side. Nothing can go all the way across like that. So they got to figure out, now look, let me just show you. I know these things are in weird order, but I think of different things to say. Look, when they drew the other side, I hope I have a drawing of that. Oh, that was the one drawing I took out. When they drew the other side, they didn't know how to do it. They didn't know how to end it, so they just it's fuzzy. But what they did, this is it. So they took this surface and then they just turned it into surface decoration. See that? So it comes over here, but that's false. And then it comes up down here and it comes around here and meets the ground. But by the time it's here, it's not a big, thick thing that's going all the way through. It's no longer a surface, it's a sign. And so that's a kind of interesting conflict, because instead of actually being a physical surface that you imagine, they've just basically painted it on the outside of that. And that's a kind of, like, we're going to ask you to interpret a building in 100 words, just whatever you think the story is about. Like, let's say this building is about a mushroom. This building is shaped like a mushroom because when you come study architecture, you should be on mushrooms. Okay? And then you got to find some detail, not bad mushrooms, you know, like really good tasting mushrooms, culinary mushrooms. When you come, but now if you had to find a detail in this building that supported your mushrooms, then you'd go to the basement and you'd find all that mold down there that the architect put down. So we're going to ask you to we're going to give you a building on campus. You tell a 100-word story about it. You got to go inside it, you got to go outside it, you got to walk around it. You got to make up a story in your mind. Whatever you think the story is about, it's fine. And then you got to find some little detail in the building that supports that story in a different way. And this is a kind of conflict. This has really been a big argument about, can you actually turn a surface which was supposed to be literal and not be about signification into a sign?